Yeah. Thanks, Patty, and thank you, everybody, for your patience while we're dealing with my young one. Should be on his way here shortly. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and chat with you guys about everybody's favorite subject, domestic cat management. It is a really urgent conservation crisis for bird conservation, as you just heard Patsy mention. And luckily, it's one of those issues where there is something each and every one of us can do, whether you own a cat or not. There are actions you can take. So with that, a broad overview of the situation basically is we have a crisis on our hands with regard to cats nationwide and in the state of Texas. And the issue is we have far more cats that need a home than there are available homes for them. And that leads to a variety of different problems associated with unowned cats, but it's also contributed to by the fact that many people do not keep their cats under their close supervision, which results in a variety of different impacts in the environment associated with wildlife conservation, public health, nuisances, private property rights, a whole host of different things. So we're going to talk about a lot of that and the science that sort of underpins those conversations in this talk. So first, I just think it's always important to know where you're getting your information. So if you don't know, American Bird Conservancy is a 501c3 nonprofit. We're dedicated to the conservation of native birds and their habitats throughout the Americas. So we work on the big bird conservation issues throughout the Western Hemisphere. And that includes direct threats to birds, such as cats or window collisions or the other direct anthropogenic threats, or also some of the indirect threats like habitat loss and habitat restoration and management for the benefit of bird populations and species. You probably are aware of this number. It made headlines a few years ago, but this coalition of scientists got together and found that basically we have experienced a net loss of about 3 billion birds in this country, or in the United States and Canada, rather, over the last 50 years. So that's 3 billion birds fewer in 2020 than in 1970. That is a tremendous loss. And of course, there are a variety of different reasons associated with that loss. It's not just domestic cats, of course, it's a whole bunch of different threats, but domestic cats are one of those contributors. And the coalition, the 3 Billion Birds campaign coalition, came up with 7 simple actions each of us can take to advance bird conservation, promote healthy populations of birds in our area. And these include buying bird-friendly consumer products such as shade-grown coffee, eliminating plastic use, making windows safer for birds, and of course keeping cats indoors. So American Bird Conservancy works on many of these topics. You can see in the top left, that is one of our solutions for making windows visible to birds. Just like people, birds do not really see windows, they do not see glass, but as people, we understand the visual cues that let us know that glass is probably there. Birds do not have the luxury of that experience. They fly headfirst into it and frequently die. We also work on stopping plastics and litter along shorelines. That's a big program that we're partnering with in Texas, along the Gulf Coast and along the entire Gulf Coast of the southern United States. We are working on habitat restoration for golden-leafed warbler up in the Midwest, upper Midwest. We're working on reducing threats to Hawaii's forest birds, basically all of which, I think maybe there are a couple of species, but almost all of them are threatened or endangered with extinction. So a lot of work going on with American Bird Conservancy, but we're not going to focus on those today. We're going to talk about cats. And so if there's one thing that I can leave you with today, I want it to be this. Domestic cats can make wonderful pets. I've got a cat myself, but they cause significant harm to birds and other wildlife while roaming outdoors. And therefore, domestic cat management is absolutely essential. And so American Bird Conservancy recognized this fact many years ago, and as a result, it has implemented this Cats Indoors program. So the Cats Indoors program is dedicated to supporting responsible cat ownership and effective unowned cat management. Now, before we get into too much of the science here, I want to make sure we're on the same page regarding terminology. A lot of these terms get used and sort of misused in a variety of different contexts. So as I'm going through the talk, I want to make sure when I'm talking about a domestic cat, I'm actually talking about a Felis catus. That is the common name for the species, domestic cat. So whether it's you call it a house cat or a pet cat or not a pet cat, it is a domestic cat. They're all the same species, Felis catus. And then you can break down these different categories of cat based on behavioral traits. So domestic cat, Felis catus, that is a biological trait. Looks like maybe somebody got my kid. That's good. I hope somebody has them. And then there is a free-ranging cat or a free-roaming cat or an at-large cat, basically a cat that has access to the outdoors without any restraint. And then there are the subcategories of free-ranging cats: stray cats, feral cats. Stray is typically habituated to people, feral cat typically not habituated to people. But that's how I'll be using these terms throughout this talk. So, speaking of domestication, cats were domesticated about 10,000 years ago in the Middle East, North Africa region. They are most closely associated with the Near Eastern wildcat, which is pictured here. But since that domestication, they have traveled around the globe as a result of their close association with people. People have transported them around the world. This study from 2011 shows the presence of cats on islands around the world, but of course they are also on every single continent except Antarctica. So they are truly a global species at this point. And they are instinctive predators. So the introduction of cats into new environments around the world has had tremendous impacts, in part because of this behavioral trait of cats, domestic cats, that it revolves around their instinctive predatory behavior that is actually not associated with their desire to consume something, not associated with hunger. And so I think probably most of us who have played with a cat or ever spent time with a cat probably have seen this in action. For this cat with a feather toy here, for example, if you're playing with a cat with a feather toy, that cat is essentially engaging in predatory behavior. It's stalking, it's pouncing, it's frequently grabbing it with its front paws and kicking it with its hind paws. That is fun, that's great engagement, great enrichment for that cat, but that same exact behavior, if it occurs outside, is absolutely fatal for wildlife. And so the cat is not necessarily trying to eat this feather toy, it's just engaging in this instinctive, fun behavior. But that same behavior, of course, is fatal for wildlife. And we know that cats, even if they are well-fed, will hunt and kill wildlife. If you've ever spent time around a cat, you probably know this, but there was a great study that sort of highlighted this. It was published in 2013 called the Kitty Cam study. And so they had cats with a collar-mounted video camera, which you can see here on the bottom left. These were owned cats, well-fed, plenty of food in their bowl at home, but they were allowed to go outside. They roamed outside, and then the collar with the video camera captured what that cat got up to. It got up to a lot of stuff that you wouldn't want your cat to get up to. But part of what they found was, of course, that it was killing wildlife like this eastern phoebe and this chipmunk. And that's probably not very surprising to anyone who spends time around cats. But what was interesting, I think, anyway, was not that they were killing wildlife, but the quantity of wildlife that they were killing and and basically only 23% of the prey that they killed were brought back to the home. And so any cat owner, and many of the studies which relied on prey returns to the home, have severely underestimated the amount or the impact that a cat has in the environment. So if a person says, well, my cat only kills one bird a month or something, actually multiply that by 4 or 5. So it stacks up pretty quickly. I also want to mention that for owned cats, one of the things about them that makes them such effective and harmful predators in the environment is that they are, we're going to get to that, whoever just made that comment. is that they have this close association with people, like we've already mentioned. They are not subject to the dynamics of their prey population. So if a cat doesn't make a kill, no big deal. Goes home, gets fed its kibble, goes to bed, has access to clean water, shelter, food, veterinary care. It is completely removed from the natural predator-prey dynamics that wild predators experience. And that means that these cats can have a tremendous impact, what some papers have called hyperpredation in their local areas. And what a 2020 study found was that cats actually exert a 2 to 10 times greater predation impact in their local environment than a similar sized native predator. And that's in part because they live at such incredible density, much higher densities than you would ever find a native predator. Okay, so, and of course, this has impact for individual birds. These are a couple of birds that were submitted to a wildlife rehabber, the golden crowned kinglet hermit thrush. You can see that these birds have suffered, well, one is a broken limb, the other one's been basically eviscerated. But even when you can't immediately identify an injured wing or anyway, something that the cat has done to the bird, frequently the animal that is attacked by a cat will still die, because cats, unlike dogs, have sharp pointed teeth that puncture down into the tissue, and they have a whole bunch of bacteria in their mouths, which can cause infection. And actually what we found through several studies looking at wildlife rehabber intakes and the ultimate outcomes for the patients is that 78% of birds that are brought into wildlife rehab facilities across the country ultimately die if they're brought in as a result of a cat attack. And that's with cutting edge veterinary, which most wild animals are not getting. So many wildlife rehab facilities are very concerned about this. It remains one of the top causes of intake at wildlife rehab facilities. And I think this poster here on the right does a good job of personifying, maybe isn't the right word, but illustrating the true nature of the impact that cats have in the environment. And I just want to mention this one paper also found that cats have caused the intake of nearly 300 different species. I mean, there's a whole host of species that cats are impacting in the environment. So I saw somebody in the chat mention the comparison with other causes of anthropogenic threats or other outcomes. This is taken from a 2015 study which reviewed the total anthropogenic cause mortality to birds in the United States and Canada, and you can see for both the United States in red, Canada in blue, that cats are the #1 source of direct human-caused bird mortality. I'll note that, however, this is a log scale, and so if we take away the log scale here and look at just the United States, cats are far and away the #1 source of direct human-caused bird mortality. 2.4 billion birds are killed every year in the United States by free-roaming domestic cats. That is the median estimate. The 95% confidence interval is 1.3 to 4 billion, but we typically use 2.4 billion. You see that's 4 times higher than buildings, window strikes, and way higher than any of the other things. So we absolutely cannot afford to ignore the consequences of free-roaming cats in the environment. They devastate birds. They're wonderful, cuddly, cute pets, but they devastate birds. And the impacts of these cats in the environment adds up. Maybe you've heard there has been some pushback on that 2.4 billion bird study. Some individuals who find it inconvenient to recognize that fact have pushed back, but similar studies from around the world have found similar results. And it turns out that this 2.4 billion birds per year is really not, unfortunately, exceptional. That China, for example, has estimated over 2 billion birds killed in that country per year. Also, cats are a major cause of wildlife mortalities in every country where this is studied. And so this adds up again to the population level and even to the species level. So domestic cats have contributed to the extinction of 63 species of birds, mammals, and reptiles in the wild. That's BMR, birds, mammals, and reptiles. They continue to impact 430 species of threatened and endangered species. They account for 26% of all bird, mammal, and reptile species extinctions caused by invasive species. They have tremendous impacts. And as a result, the IUCN, or International Union for Conservation of Nature, has listed domestic cats to be among the top 100 most harmful invasive species globally. That's the best known case study of domestic cats causing significant, severe, and swift species extinction or population impacts that have led to species extinction is with the Stevens Island wren, or Lyle's wren. This occurred in the 1890s when a lighthouse keeper was posted on Stevens Island. He took his cat, presumably was named Tibbles. I don't know where that comes from, but it's been written down. It doesn't really matter. And he let his cat out, as everybody did back at that time. One day it brought home this bird in its mouth, and he was into birds, so he tried to identify it. Said, I don't know what this is. He sent it off to a museum. They said, oh, this is a brand new species. We've never seen this. And then within 2 years, it was entirely extinct as a result of cat depredation. So they can have impacts very, very quickly. They also can modify ecosystems and behaviors of prey species. So they can change the dynamics, the community that exists in a given area as a result of their presence. And so one study in 2004 in California found that in habitats where there were no cats, they had more birds, more native rodents, and fewer non-native rodents. But in habitats with cat, they found fewer birds, fewer native rodents, and more non-native rodents. And the distinction, I think, there between native and non-native rodents is important because the non-native rodents typically have spent more time around wild felids of that size, whether it's Norway rat or house mouse or whatever, and are more challenging for cats also to hunt and kill, whereas the native rodents are somewhat naive. The cats can also have an impact just by their mere presence in the environment. This 2013 study with a really long title, but Fearing the Feline, it used a model of a domestic cat, placed it near the nest of a common blackbird. This was in the UK. They left it there for 15 minutes and then they took it away and they observed the common blackbird nest to see what happened. What they found was that the adults in the nest reduced the amount of food provided to the young by 1/3, and that the presence of the cat increased the likelihood of nest depredation by another species by an order of magnitude. And so what happens is the common blackbirds, they recognize that that cat is there, and suddenly they think, maybe I shouldn't go out foraging. I need to engage in some anti-predator behavior, let the cat know, hey, I see you, please don't come kill me, even though it's just a model of the cat. It wasn't going to impact them at all. And that change in behavior reduces the likelihood of reproductive success and then increases the likelihood of nest mortality because of other predators then seeing them and saying, oh man, there's a nest there, I'll go kill it. And then I also want to make a comment about this 1999 study of Cripps and Soule, and that the types of habitats where cats are roaming can also be impacted, and there can be some trophic dynamics here. This is the graph here with the coyote, the cat, and the bird. And so what they found was that in smaller fragmented habitats, these isolated patches, there were lots of cats and there were no birds. And I think ground nesting birds were entirely extirpated. But in larger patches of habitat where coyotes would roam, suddenly you didn't get as many cats and the birds would flourish. So there are these interesting predator-prey dynamics where cats are not necessarily the predator, or they are the mesopredator. So, there are these, I guess, connections between habitat connectivity and preservation, and also with the impacts of domestic cats roaming the environment. So, quick review. Domestic cats are an introduced species, a predator in the United States that can contribute to just ridiculous numbers of bird mortality. 2.4 billion birds killed every single year. And they also impact other populations, not just birds, but other wildlife in direct and indirect methods. And we're going to talk a little bit more about those indirect means of impact from domestic cats in the environment to wildlife as well as people. And so this is a list of some of the diseases, parasites and diseases that cats can carry and transmit. I think they're all transmissible to people. Yeah, I think, anyway, I don't, but many of them are at least. And I'm not going to talk about all of them, but just the point here is there are a lot. There are a lot of diseases that cats can carry and transmit to people. And so that's something to keep in mind as you consider how we should be managing domestic cats. Two of them I will talk about are rabies and toxoplasmosis. So rabies. Everybody's familiar with rabies, right? Old Yeller. Maybe, well, that date me? I don't know. But so Old Yeller is no longer Old Yeller in the United States. It's Old Tabby these days. Cats are now the #1 source of rabies among domestic animals nationwide. They outpace dogs about 4 to 1. And rabies remains primarily an Eastern United States disease, but Texas is also a bit of a hotspot for it as well. Now, wildlife still are the #1 source of rabies generally, but among domestic animals, cats are primarily the #1 source nationwide. And so there's a disproportionate exposure risk associated with cats that are rabid also, or that are carrying rabies, because you're far more likely to try and interact with an unknown cat than you are with skunk, fox, bat, you know, especially for kids who don't know anything about rabies or how to protect themselves from smashing their fingers in the door. You know, they're likely to say, "Hey, here, kitty, kitty," and then all of a sudden they get clawed or whatever, and then they have a rabies exposure risk if you don't know the history of that particular individual cat. And of course, we want to be diligent about providing that post-exposure prophylaxis, that vaccine, to protect against actually acquiring rabies, because once symptoms arise, you're dead. That's it. So let's look at it in Texas. This is the pattern of cat rabies in Texas over the last 30 years. You can see it ebbs and flows, and that is consistent with the prevalence of rabies among other domestic animals in the state. But one thing that I think is interesting is what proportion of domestic animals cats represent in terms of rabid animals. And you can see it has increased basically consistently over the last 30 years. And now domestic cats represent over 50% of all rabid domestic animals in the state. So clearly we are not doing something for domestic cats that we may be doing for other species. Okay, so that's rabies. I'm going to now talk about toxoplasmosis. Who has heard of toxoplasmosis? What an educated group. That's great. So most people have heard about it when they are having a kid and their OBGYN says, don't change cat litter, right? Yeah, everybody's heard that. That's good advice. It's because cats, felines, are the definitive host for toxoplasmosis, or for Toxoplasma gondii, which is the parasite that causes toxoplasmosis. It means that felines, and I'm specifically using felines here because that includes mountain lions, bobcats, jaguars, lions, tigers, whatever, are the only group of animals in which the parasite can complete its life cycle. It can only sexually reproduce in the gut of a feline. But a single domestic cat can excrete up to hundreds of millions of these tiny infectious oocysts into the environment, and they survive and remain infectious for months to years in terrestrial, freshwater, or marine environments. And a single oocyst is enough to infect any warm-blooded species, any bird or mammal. So we're talking about the capacity for a huge amount of environmental contamination as a result of cats roaming the landscape. So there are a variety of reasons you don't want to get Toxoplasma gondii, and I'm going to talk about those more in a minute. But take note of this infographic, I guess, on the right. It can move through the ecosystem. Basically, once it gets into the environmental stage of oocysts, where the domestic cat or other feline has excreted it in the environment, then it can flow through the watershed, move through the ecosystem, and any, again, bird or mammal can become infected either by ingesting or inhaling accidentally any oocyst, or by consuming the infected tissues of any other animal that has been infected with Toxoplasma gondii. one of the really interesting things about this disease, and I think it's an absolutely fascinating disease, which is maybe a weird thing to say, but the more I learn, the cooler it is this Toxoplasma gondii is a zombie parasite. It can modify the host behavior. And so this was first identified in this paper in 2000, where some researchers looked at Toxoplasma. I'm going to say toxo, by the way, for short. It's a real mouthful. Toxo-infected rats in the lab. They had toxo-infected rats, non-toxo-infected rats, and then they exposed them to various stimuli to see where they decided to spend their time. And what they found was that there was no significant difference between the infected and uninfected rats when exposed to their own scent, or rat scent, when they were exposed to a neutral odor, which is water, when they were exposed to a rabbit scent. But there was a significant difference in how they chose to spend their time when they were exposed to the scent of a cat. And those that were infected with toxo chose to spend more time in the location where there was more of the cat scent. And so what we've seen over multiple research studies now is that toxo changes the way that the brain behaves, at least in rodents, and it stimulates them. It turns them on a bit, and they become more attracted to cat urine, and thus increases the amount of time they choose to spend in an area which is habituated by a cat, which increases the likelihood of them then interacting, and then increases the likelihood of that cat killing that rodent and then completing the life cycle of the parasite. So the parasite modifies the host behavior to increase the odds of it completing its life cycle and being able to sexually reproduce. Isn't that cool?
That's scary.
I think, yeah, it is. It is scary. A little. But it's really cool, too. And you know, there are other zombie parasitism examples throughout the animal kingdom. But you know, this one is really, really interesting. So, Toxoplasma gondii infection in people. Toxo in people. It can have a variety of implications. So when that OBGYN tells you not to change cat litter while you are pregnant, that is great advice because it can cause miscarriages, fetal deformities, blindness, deafness, whole host of problems that you don't want to experience. But I think it's also worth noting that when you have cats free roaming in the environment, they're not pooping in litter boxes. They're pooping everywhere. It might be your garden. It might be this little kid's sandbox. That is one of the places where they choose to defecate. And so basically, we just need to be mindful about the environmental contamination associated with cats roaming in the environment because of the huge implications associated with toxoplasma infection and ultimately toxoplasmosis. And so it is particularly damaging for individuals with compromised immune system like HIV or AIDS. It's fatal. But it's also problematic for those with otherwise healthy, normal immune systems as well, up to and including organ failure and death. But it can be as little as flu-like symptoms. That makes it difficult to also identify because you don't necessarily think, oh, I've got flu-like symptoms, I must have toxo. You think, I've got the flu. So you don't go to your doctor, you don't seek treatment. But despite that, we believe that about 12% or so of the United States are affected. There are about 1 million people that are newly infected with toxo every single year in the United States. It's, I'm checking my notes, 3,000 cases of ocular toxoplasmosis. So that's what this, on the top left, this image is of the eye. That's a little cyst in the eye, which can cause blindness. There are a lot of reasons why you don't want to have toxo in the environment. And one of them, going back to that zombie host interaction, is how it can modify human behavior also as a result of infection. And so you can see the headlines from some of these publications: impairing memory in infected seniors, public health problem, how and why toxoplasma makes us crazy. And so that, this relationship between rodents, in the study we looked at before, rats and cat urine, has been borne out in other wildlife as well, in that it modifies their behavior. In particular, it modifies risk-taking behavior. This was most recently identified in wolves in Yellowstone. Before that, there was a good study on hyenas in East Africa, and it found that those hyenas that were infected and those wolves that were infected with toxo took riskier behaviors. And for hyenas, they were more likely to be killed by lions. It was the result for them. But interesting, it's just It's such a fascinating disease. Look into it. It's really cool. But one of the things I want to point out is that, from a public health perspective, we especially need to be concerned about at-risk populations of people. And so this one study, which I've pulled out this little excerpt here on the bottom right, found that 82% of cats trapped in Richmond, this is Richmond, Virginia, were within roaming distance of a public elementary or preschool grounds, public parks, or community gardens. This is places where people primarily, or very frequently at least, put their hands in the dirt, are not necessarily acting in the most sanitary of way. Little kids, as I know, are always putting their hands in their mouths and not washing their hands. So that's an exposure risk for toxo. There's also an agricultural component associated with Toxoplasma gondii. It can infect a wide variety of species, as we've mentioned, but it seems to be particularly harmful for pigs, sheep, and goats. Yeah. And they suffer from acute toxoplasmosis. This has economic implications also for producers who are trying to raise the next generation and send them off for human consumption. There was one case of what they called an abortion storm among sheep on a ranch in Texas, where basically all the pregnant ewes suddenly aborted as a result of exposure to toxo, which can have a huge impact for the producer on their bottom line. Yes, and it can also impact not just animals, but again, getting into the environment, it has been found on vegetables, produce that has gone to market. So this was a study in Virginia, 2021, where they found that they went to grocery stores, retail stores, and also farmers markets, and they found it didn't matter, conventional, organic, a grocery store, at a farmer's market, there were samples that came back positive for toxic. So do yourself a favor, make sure you wash your fruit and vegetables before you consume them. Cook them is even better. That's how you kill the parasite, but definitely wash and try and get all of that off. And it's also worth noting that the CDC actually lists toxo to be among the top 5 neglected parasitic diseases in the United States, and it is the second leading cause of death among foodborne illnesses in the U.S. I mean, this is small stuff. It's after salmonella. Toxo is the second leading cause of foodborne illness. Now, moving on, toxo in wildlife. I hope you wanted to spend some time on toxo because we're doing it. Again, I find it fascinating, so you have to suffer. It impacts wildlife to a large extent. And again, we're going to talk about this environmental contamination component because it gets into the environment and then it survives. It remains infectious and it can move through the environment through rainfall events like we just had, especially when there hasn't been a lot of rain. You get some rain and then boom, it moves through the environment very quickly. There's this study in California, that's this image on the bottom left, which found that oocysts deposited into the environment in the highlands in California, in the drier mountains. They would flow through the watershed into the nearshore marine environment, ultimately infecting southern sea otters, which are a federally threatened species, and killing them, or modifying their behavior in such a way that they were more available for depredation events from sharks. So toxo-infected sea otters were more likely to be killed by sharks. In that study, there were other sources of oocyst contamination in the environment. There are mountain lions, there are bobcats, and domestic cats. But if we look at Hawaii, which is this image on the far right, this is from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. In Hawaii, there are no other felines. There are only domestic cats. So if there is toxo in the environment in Hawaii, we know where it's coming from. It's exclusively coming from domestic cat. And obviously, there's toxo in Hawaii, or I wouldn't be talking about it. And so what we find there is huge amounts of toxo in the environment. It's infecting birds, it's infecting mammals. NOAA is particularly concerned because it's killing Hawaiian monk seals, which are a fairly endangered species, and of which there are only about 300 left in the main Hawaiian Islands. So the feces, or really the oocysts, it's not really the feces, the oocysts being deposited in the environment in Hawaii, flowing through the watersheds, getting into the marine environment, and impacting monk seals, but also infecting a whole bunch of other species along the way. And so this kills wildlife. It causes indirect effects. I've already mentioned the modified behavior in lions or in hyenas and their interactions with lions and in wolves, but it also causes a human consumption risk also. So deer. There was a study in northern Ohio which found that about 60% of deer were infected with Toxoplasma gondii. And obviously, these are species, deer are not interacting with cats directly. It's cats were depositing oocysts into the environment through their feces, and then deer were munched on some grass that may have had some oocysts on them. They get infected, then they can pass it on to their unborn fawns. But if a hunter then goes in and harvests that deer and doesn't cook the meat all the way through, suddenly that's an exposure risk for that hunter. Okay, so review. Domestic cats are a top source of rabies in the United States, and the proportion of rabid domestic animals in Texas that cats represent has been increasing over the last 30 years. And toxo is a crazy disease that you don't want, and there's massive environmental contamination associated with domestic cats roaming the environment. So we're going to go back to this initial point that I made earlier. Domestic cats can make wonderful pets. Again, I have a cat myself. I've had cats most of my life. They're great, but they can cause significant harm to birds and other wildlife, as well as represent a public health risk when they roam the environment. So we have to manage domestic cats. So really what we need to do is reduce cat populations. As I mentioned, we have too many cats for the number of homes that want them. So one of the things we really need to do is turn off the tap when it comes to domestic cat populations. And so setting aside the unowned cat population for a moment, we're never going to solve that problem unless we get the owned cat population solved. Because we are overbreeding, we're not sterilizing our own cats, we're letting them wander outside, we're not managing them effectively to reduce or ultimately hopefully eliminate their impacts in the environment and this surge in the cat population that we're experiencing. So we need to take care of the owned cat population through responsible cat ownership activities. And of course, one of the most important questions we have to ask with regard to responsible cat ownership, because of all the things we've talked about already, is are those cats still roaming outdoors? And I'm here to say, if they are still roaming outdoors, that is not responsible cat ownership.
They are.
I've seen a few, yeah. Yeah, there are a lot of them still out there. So what are some of the management solutions that we can implement? Yes, you should walk your cat on a leash. That is a truly viable option that most people don't think about, don't want. One of the things about cats that I think has been so alluring for many is that it is a disposable pet, and that is no longer acceptable. You can open the door, kick it out, say, it returns. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. Maybe it'll show up a month from now. We don't treat them with the same value or respect that we treat some of our other companion animals. So we can increase that value and respect, be better stewards of our cats and of the environment, of public health, by implementing some of these management solutions, by containing cats, if you allow them to go outdoors, do so in a way where they are supervised, on a leash, in a stroller, in a catio. I saw you have some brochures here from Catio Spaces. That's good stuff. And this is consistent with the policy position from the American Veterinary Medical Association on free roaming on cats. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. I also want to mention from a cat health and welfare perspective, it is absolutely in the cat's best interest to be safely contained, either in a confined space outdoors or in let's see, I'm going to go, this work? It won't, no. I need to do that. Boy, I'm going to do it with a second screen, but I'm not sure how to do it with a single screen. Anyway, I'll just tell you what happens. This coyote comes up on this person's porch and it attacks this cat. And they go back and forth for about a minute. Eventually the cat does escape. It climbs up one of these posts and the coyote is unable to get to it. But that's after this coyote has really gone after it, nipped it a few times. The coyote is being a little cautious. Cats can fight back a little bit, but coyotes can do a real number on cats in the environment. And this is also, I would say, a huge public health concern. Well, maybe not public health, but public safety concern. We don't want to be drawing coyotes up onto people's back patio. So if you're feeding cats outside, or really any animal outside, that's a potential risk. And if you have cats roaming in the environment, coyotes will hunt and kill cats. Okay, so coyotes will kill cats if they're outside. Other animals will kill cats. Cats also experience a higher prevalence of parasites, about 3 times more likely to harbor parasites if they're roaming outside. They also get hit by cars. Basically, they have a reduced life expectancy and much higher likelihood of injury, disease, etc. Went too far. This is that stuff. So, harkening back to this AVMA policy statement, you can read sort of the full thing there, but they identify a bunch of risks, some of which I just mentioned, that are underlining why they don't think cats really should be roaming outdoors. And they encourage veterinarians to inform their clients about these risks and why it's important not just for the cat, but also for the community, really, for wildlife, for public health and safety, etc., to keep cats responsibly indoors or on a leash, in a catio, some sort of enclosure, to prevent them from roaming the environment. I think it's also consistent with the veterinary oath, and there are a variety of components in the veterinary oath that I think really mandate a stronger position on keeping cats indoors and domestic cat management in general, and that is the mention of scientific knowledge. By the way, we're a science-based nonprofit. At least you could guess that from all the studies I've been citing. And so, everything that I've been telling you here is founded in the peer-reviewed published literature. I'm not making any of this up. Happy to share the references with you if you would like them. It's also better for the protection of animal health and welfare. And notice that it's animal health and welfare, not just cat health and welfare. And I think too frequently you get veterinarians who are concerned about the outcome exclusively for the domestic cat and not for the broader animal kingdom at large. Prevention of animal suffering, also again, animals, not just cats. Conservation of animal resources, I think we have clearly identified why it's better to keep cats indoors from that perspective. And finally, the promotion of public health, and hopefully we've seen that also. And I want to mention that there is a selfish perspective for veterinarians also to promote cats indoors and responsible domestic cat management. This is an exposure risk pathway from a study that was looking at Toxoplasma gondii infection in veterinarians around the world. And they found that a bunch of veterinarians were getting toxo. They identified percentages in various countries. I think in Finland, it was 15%, Canadian veterinarians, 14%, Estonian veterinarians, 46%. Not sure what was going on there. 20% in Malaysia. And, there's been this ongoing sort of mental health crisis among veterinarians recently. It's a stressful job, it's tough. And I'm certainly not going to say that it's all due to Toxoplasma gondii infection. It's definitely not. But I wouldn't be at all surprised if it is a contributing factor because there are associations with neurological disorders. Schizophrenia is one of those neurological disorders associated with toxo infection. Bipolar disorder. Anyway, depression is kind of a crisis within the veterinary profession. And toxo would not be doing anyone any favors in that regard. So when it comes to management of domestic cats, disease control is, of course, one of the priority components of that. So the National Association of State Public Health Veterinarians puts out a compendium of animal rabies prevention and control. And they say all dogs, cats, and ferrets should be vaccinated against rabies and revaccinated in accordance with recommendations in this compendium, which is basically do it in association with the manufacturer recommendations. And that revaccination is absolutely essential. So if that cat has not been vaccinated, so it has to be vaccinated one time, vaccinated again after 1 year, and then vaccinated every 1 to 3 years, depending on the vaccination that it's given. If it's not given all that, you cannot be certain that it's not going to be positive for rabies. Actually, even then, you're really not certain, but there's a pretty good chance that you're not going to get rabies from a currently vaccinated cat. But if it's not currently vaccinated, your exposure risk goes up quite a bit. So it's in the best, what am I looking for here? It's in everybody's best interest here that we have our companion animals currently vaccinated for rabies. Again, it's fatal once symptoms arise. And then with regard to toxo, policies that are put in place for domestic cat management that maintain them roaming in the environment. You can read this full quote if you want, but basically it says it contributes to the toxo exposure risks. And only by removing cats from the environment are we really preventing the further transmission of toxo. So I would argue that we need to look at domestic cat management from a One Health perspective. This is the idea that domestic animal, wild animal, human, and really environmental health are all interrelated. And it considers, it generally is talked about within disease control circles, but it also has to do with biodiversity loss. And so I think for all of these reasons, from a One Health perspective, we definitely need to get domestic cats under control. So there are opportunities for everyone to take action in their daily lives. We mentioned the 7 simple actions at the beginning of the talk. There are definitely steps you could take in your life, whether you have a cat or not. If you do, you can be a model of responsible cat behavior. Take your cat for a walk on a leash, keep it inside, build a catio for it. Just don't open the door and hope it comes back. Keep it up to date on its shots. Sterilize it, microchip it. Identification is great, so if it becomes lost, you can get it back at a much higher rate. You can take the pledge to keep your cats indoors through American Bird Conservancy. You can share this information with others. Some cats indoors brochures are available here. We have others on our website. They're free to download, or you can order them. You can support model ordinances where you live. Things like, again, identification, sterilization, keeping cats under an owner's control. And you can be a part of the Bird City Network. Now, San Antonio is a bird city, but I'm not fully up to date on what they are or are not doing. The website, the birdcity.org website, does not have much information on what they have chosen to implement to be a bird city. But one of the things to be a bird city, at least one of the higher flyer categories, is you need to be responsible about domestic cat management. You cannot avoid it. So I would encourage you, if anybody's involved in the Bird City program, that might be worth checking into to see what San Antonio is doing. So in review, basically cats are a problem for wildlife and the environment. We have to manage them. We need everybody to step up and take action on this. And it's not rocket science. And we're not calling for anything revolutionary. We're just talking about treating cats like we treat dogs, basically. Same level of value and respect that we provide for dogs, also for cats. That's it in a nutshell. And that's it for me. So thanks. I'd be happy to take any questions, however you want to proceed. Thank you.
Questions in the room? I have one. When you were discussing toxo, when a cat is infected with it, how does it kill the cat, or
No.
is
No
just
symptoms.
a vector?
Yep, virtually no symptoms. I mean, occasionally they will, but generally you have no idea.
Okay. So how do you find out if your cat is infected? You have to take it.
Blood test.
But
Now, is that test, is it an antibody test, or is it different? Because they can have positive antibodies, but not the oocysts. They can clear it, can they not?
Sort of. So they will excrete oocysts for a period of 1 to 3 weeks, and then they can shed, is what it's really called. They can shed oocysts again later in their life if they become reinfected or if they have a drop in their immune system. So possible. They don't clear it entirely. No, they will show antibodies to it for the rest of their lives, as will anybody. Once you get toxo, you got it for life. There's no getting rid of it.
There is PCR testing that will find DNA.
Liz, would you stand up and so we can hear you? Your voice is very soft.
There is some PCR testing that can be done, but again, that would be a thing. That wouldn't really tell you, is your cat a dangerous shedder or not? That amplifies DNA.
Yeah, the antibody test could tell you if it's currently shedding, most likely. But most people aren't getting these tests done. It's not standard.
Your pet cat is not going to be your main source, especially as a pregnant veterinarian. My doctor's advice to not to go to the litter box, but you're much more likely to get it from gardening. Neighbor cats, the stray cats that you're getting it from. Your pet cat, your litter box, those oocysts have to sit for at least 48 hours, I think, before they're infected anyway. So.
Yeah, so that's a really important distinction. Thank you for bringing that up. And in terms of
Could you repeat that so everybody can hear?
Yeah, so The statement was that you're more likely to get toxo from the environment. Your pet cat is not your primary exposure pathway for Toxoplasma gondii. And that's true. So one, in part because your pet cat, especially if it's kept indoors and fed a commercial food, like a kibble, is not likely to come across toxo to begin with. They're getting it either from their mother or from the environment also. And so then they're going to excrete it into a litter box, presumably. And if you clean your litter box regularly, there's not much risk of you getting it. It doesn't, it's called sporulation. It doesn't sporulate. It takes a couple days to do that. I think it's 2 to 5 days it will sporulate. And then it becomes infective and will remain infectious, I guess, for a long period of time. But if you're cleaning your litter box regularly, if you're not feeding your cat raw food, if it's not hunting and killing wildlife, which would be raw food consumption, then it's a very low likelihood that your specific cat has toxo. Again, it all kind of comes down to the free roaming component.
You had a,
So I talk to a lot of cat owners and try to explain to them about cats being hunters and problems. And almost to the person, they say, "Oh, not my cat.
yeah, I know.
My little kitty, my cat's 13 years old. It barely moves." And so I'm wondering if you have a good response to that I could use.
I don't have a data-driven response. I think this is one of the big gaps with this particular issue is the human dimensions component. And we're working on some of the social science to identify what are the persuasive messages, what are people thinking about cat management generally. Well, and there is some validity to saying older cats don't hunt and kill wildlife at as high a rate as younger cats, but that doesn't mean it's zero. And of course, that doesn't have anything to do with the potential disease transmission risks or the nuisances for your neighbor. Your neighbor doesn't necessarily want your cat peeing on their car or pooping in their garden. So, part of this is just about being a good neighbor. And on a personal note, I grew up with outdoor cats, and I was one of those people that if you told me it needs to stay inside, I'd say, "You're crazy. You don't understand anything about cats." And now I'm doing this. So I've done the 180 a little bit because I became educated. I learned about ecology and conservation. I learned about how to be a good pet owner. I don't have a great response. I would say one of the more persuasive arguments you can make is for the health and welfare of the cat itself. By letting your cat outside, you're exposing it to parasites and diseases that cat might not otherwise be exposed to. You're also exposing your entire family to those things, whether they're ticks or fleas or tapeworms or whatever the case may be. You're exposing it to potential injury. You're exposing it to attacks from coyotes or dogs or other cats or whatever. There's a whole bunch of things from that perspective that I think tend to be more persuasive for the cat owner. There are a whole lot of arguments you can use, but that tends to be one of the more persuasive ones.